Hey folks, I'm brownbear. This is the 6th in a 10-part design commentary series on competitive StarCraft 2. If you missed the previous parts, I recommend you watch them before watching this video. For clarity's sake, anytime you hear the word StarCraft, I mean StarCraft 2. If I'm referencing Brood War, I'll just call it Brood War. Finally, I recommend that you watch this video from beginning to end. However, for the convenience of folks who prefer to jump around, I've provided timestamps to major talking points in the description below. I'd like to start today by discussing strategic balance through a high skill ceiling. Previously we discussed how StarCraft is designed and balanced around near optimal execution. We justified this by pointing out how difficult it would be to balance the game if we couldn't make this assumption. The number of inefficient ways of playing the game will always be much larger than the number of efficient ways. It's just practical to assume near optimal play. It makes designing and balancing the game a tractable problem. When you think about what this means from a gameplay perspective, you end up with a spectrum. On one end you have optimal play, always making the right decisions and executing in a mechanically perfect way. On the other end you have terrible play, failing to exercise even the most basic game mechanics. The designer's job is to craft a gameplay experience such that most players fall somewhere in the middle. The top end of the competitive ladder sits somewhere around here. It's far enough away from optimal play that even professionals can substantially improve. This helps ensure that competition is skill-based, downplays design or balance problems in the game itself, and rewards practice time. The bottom end is far enough away from terrible play to ensure that the average player is still able to exercise all of the game's basic features. It wouldn't be a good experience if even simple tasks like putting down production buildings required hundreds of actions per minute. I'd argue that the two sides are difficult to disconnect. Regardless of the intended audience, a gameplay change will affect everyone on the ladder, from the very top to the very bottom. I think of the ideal like constructing a walkway up a tall mountain. Regardless of where you are on the path, you should always be able to see your next step, and you should always feel that it's achievable given enough practice time. Let's think about how this works for the people at the top, the folks trying to reach the summit. StarCraft's unreachably high skill ceiling ensures that no human will ever play the game perfectly. There's always room to substantially improve. I'll illustrate this with a simple example from the military side of the game. Unless they're identical, two unit compositions will never be equally powerful. One will always be slightly better than the other. That isn't really hard to believe if you think about it. When two armies fight each other, there's a near infinite number of possible outcomes, only one of which is dead even. All the other possible outcomes have one of the armies coming out ahead. If the game executes deterministically, which it does, and we assume no human intervention, then the outcome becomes predictable. That, of course, is the key: no human intervention. In other words, because the computer executes deterministically, it executes the same behavior every single time. This is a problem because it makes outcomes very predictable. From a metagame perspective, that's a huge deal. Why would you bother building any unit composition except the very best one? Humans fall into the same trap when they reach a game's theoretical skill ceiling. When a game has been quote-unquote solved, players understand the optimum set of decisions in any given situation and learn how to execute them perfectly. This rapidly narrows the strategic metagame because the optimum of one race or one strategy will simply be better than all of the others. Like I mentioned last time, this is rarely the end of the story. Players continue trying to squeeze power out of optimum interactions and end up venturing into the no man's land of unintended behavior. Situations like this rarely occur in StarCraft because the skill ceiling is intentionally unreachable. You can always play a situation better than you did. This reduces the predictability of any given engagement or strategy and enables genuine diversity in the strategic metagame. Personally, I think most fans of competitive real-time strategy really underestimate how much of a big deal this is. The devolution into a pathological single strategy metagame occurred over and over in numerous other franchises. One of the ways StarCraft's skill ceiling prevents this is its use of diminishing returns, the amount of value derived from an increase in player skill. Climbers at the top of our skill mountain are still very far from the summit. The steps in front of them, if achieved, continue to offer dramatic increases in power. To illustrate this, I've pulled up Game 5 of the BlizzCon finals between ByuN and Dark. On your screen you'll see a mid-game engagement between ByuN's Bio Tank and Dark's Lingbane Queen. These are two of the best players in the world, but there's still plenty of room for improvement. ByuN misses an opportunity to pick off between 5 and 7 Lings, and Dark pushes out onto creep a couple seconds too late, weakening his attack force by removing his queens from the fight. Aside from these mistakes, there's also positive things each player could have been doing. Dark could have flanked better with banelings, and ByuN could have simultaneously been dropping or picking off overlords had either player developed the requisite multitasking ability. Importantly, these areas for improvement don't showcase substantial diminishing returns. My description above is intentionally truncated, but even just fixing what I mentioned would substantially increase each player's attack power. Diminishing returns are important not just as a standalone concept, but also for understanding StarCraft 2's relationship with Brood War. The difference in philosophy around diminishing returns is, to me, one of the most fundamental differences between the two games. A wonderful quote from Artosis explains it better than I can. In SC1, a lot of winning was about practicing with the best. If C Shield can get 11 more Marines than the average top ladder player by the 12-minute mark, then you will literally never beat him by practicing on the ladder. On the contrary, in SC2, if you know your opponent is going roaches, it doesn't matter if he has 12 or 17 in the mid-game push quite as much, because you are taking the fight in a choke with Immortal Tech and Force Fields. What I'm trying to say here is, it is far more important to be in the top 95% of macro players and know all the different reactionary branches of your build orders, than to be in the top 99.9% of macro players and have a general idea of what to do. The difference in diminishing returns pushes players to practice and play differently, ultimately pushing the games in two very different directions, Brood War toward the mechanical side, and StarCraft 2 toward the strategic side. Diminishing returns can also help us understand balance issues. Personally, I actually define balance problems through this lens. Here's how I see it in an article I wrote a few months back. Assume two players A and B playing races X and Y. There exists a racial imbalance between X and Y if, in a game between A and B, the player that lost cannot be reasonably expected to improve their play significantly enough to have reliably won the game. In other words, a balance problem is one that requires input from the designer. If players can solve a problem by themselves, then the game itself can't be at fault. The more tools players have at their disposal, the fewer diminishing returns that exist on their skill level, the fewer balance problems there will be. This is what I mean when I say StarCraft is balanced through a high skill ceiling. Almost everyone on the ladder can simply improve their way out of a bad situation. With the top end of the spectrum out of the way, let's discuss the bottom. StarCraft's modern user interface contains boatloads of convenience features that make it easy for new players to exercise the game's mechanics. I'd characterize its approach here as fairly cautious, making it easy to execute some baseline activity, while simultaneously biasing toward the worst possible default behavior. Unit positioning is a good example. StarCraft's design heavily favors the concave unit position. It's an efficient way to engage an opposing army. Your army focuses on your opponent's outermost units, whereas your opponent's army essentially selects targets randomly. Oftentimes, units within the convex aren't even in range of the opposing army. This means that a player can devastate an equally strong opponent, just by leveraging good positioning. The strength of the concave is driven by a number of design decisions: the existence of attack move, the choice to have units attack the first enemy they see, and the existence of strong collision between friendly units. What's more interesting are the design decisions around unit movement. Armies by default move in a convex or ball formation. Constructing a concave actually requires quite a lot of manual intervention by the player. In fact, many players pre-spread their armies to reduce mechanical overhead in the middle of a heated engagement. In combination, these two design choices create an easy-to-learn but hard-to-master experience. The streamlined user interface enables a baseline behavior. Players can move their units with unlimited unit selection and strong pathing. Meanwhile, the decisions around default behavior ensure that units execute these actions in a fairly dumb way. It's almost certain that this was an intentional design choice, given that units were able to stay in formation back in Brood War. To go back to our mountain analogy, new players get to feel like they're starting at base camp. There's plenty of content within the game that feels perfectly achievable. At the same time, they're never under the illusion that this is the summit. They can clearly see a path in front of them. Alrighty, I think that's a good place to cut episode 6. Next time we'll dive into target audience and StarCraft as a game versus StarCraft as a product. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me here or on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.